125, we're down to security operations. We're nearly done. We'll do this chapter today, one more chapter last time, and I've got no new material for the last time. This is CISSP. I'm not adding anything new to it, so I'll just be around to help anybody that wants help next time, and then there's the final exam. So we're pretty much near the end, and here we go. We already did the first bit of this chapter last time because it's kind of long, so we should be able to finish it up today. So, preventive, detective controls. These are controls that detect some kind of attack and block it. So an IDS detects malicious actions, and a lot of people use this term for also something that would block malicious attacks. If you want to be picky, that would be an IPS that prevents the attacks by doing something like changing a firewall rule. You can have one for a whole network, which means it can send a firewall on the edge of the network and protect it all, or you can have one on the hosts, like Tripwire. The one on the host has more information about what's happening on that host. It can be connected to the log entries on that host, but it can only protect one host. So like antivirus, you might well have two of these, two layers for redundancy. So you'll have the internet, a firewall blocking out obviously bad stuff, and then an intrusion detection system getting a copy of all the traffic and being managed here just to detect things and raise alerts and log entries, but it doesn't block anything. But an intrusion prevention system is in line with the network, so you have the firewall and the prevention system and then the trusted network, and you manage it here, so if it doesn't like something, it can block it. And that means, of course, if the intrusion protection system makes a mistake or goes down, you lose connectivity. So it's more important for availability to keep it up. So the simplest kind matches patterns. This is what Snort does. Snort just has a regular expression sort of rules saying packets that match these rules shall be blocked. It can also detect protocol errors like TCP packets with an invalid combination of flags like SYN and FIN, which is possible, but it does not make any sense. And you can just detect anomalies. You can record normal traffic and trigger or block traffic that varies from baseline in some way. This is quite difficult in practice because normal traffic is very unsteady and has bursts of traffic and strange traffic. It's difficult to have to perform this very well, but people do try to do it. Then there's SIEM systems. The leader for a long time has been Splunk. I've heard people say QRadar might be taking away its crown these days. But anyway, this is something that will correlate all the data from many sources. It'll have the logs from your firewalls and your servers and routers and everything you've got all going to one place, and then you can analyze it. Now, there was an old system where you would certify and accredit your system every 3 years, and then they switched to continuous security monitoring, where you would constantly be scanning to make sure patches are in and such. But SIEM is a more thorough thing where it actually knows all the log entries and you can hunt through it looking for threats. The threat hunting is the kind of thing you can do with Splunk. You can look for trouble. Even if there's not an alert going off, you could go there and examine the traffic and manually look for unusual traffic and sometimes detect things before your intrusion detection systems detect it. All right, then there's data loss prevention. This watches the data leaving the network and notices if data you don't want to leave is leaving, like credit card numbers or passwords or anything. You can put a watermark on your confidential files and you can watch for that watermark to go by to see if things are leaving. This is how Google caught the Chinese attack in 2010. They did not catch it on the way in. They did not catch it in the logs. They caught it on the way out. They found packets of data leaving their network, going to a Chinese server that was not theirs. And they said, why is stuff going to China? And they tracked down the process that was sending that, and they found that their data was being stolen. So this can be far more important than you might imagine. So you got endpoint security. The simplest way was antivirus. Now you have a lot more. Antivirus, whitelisting of applications, so only known good applications can run. And now called allow listing is the better term than whitelisting. Controls for removal media like UPS sticks, encryption, host intrusion prevention system, and firewalls. These are the modern endpoint security suites that you put on your endpoints like Carbon Black to try to prevent people from running malware on the endpoints. This is considered one of the most important things to do to avoid ransomware. So you have strong endpoint security that will hopefully detect it when people try to run it. Then antivirus, of course, is the older system that works by denial listing primarily. It just has a list of known virus signatures and it blocks things like that, which is a problem. What's much better is allow listing, where you only let known good things to run. This is much more likely to work. The problem is it's hard to maintain because you have to keep updating your list of good things every time there's a patch or new application or anything, and that's a lot of administrative burden. This, however, is how the iPhone works. The iPhone works, you can only load things from the official Apple store that are signed by Apple, so anything that is not there, you can't run it. And that turns out to be extremely effective at keeping malware off the iPhone. And then, of course, removable video controls. There was a time when you had auto run, you'd put in a USB stick and it would automatically run. That was an XP. Nowadays, that's turned off by default. And disk encryption. There are various encryption schemes available, and what you have to do is encrypt the whole hard drive. That's the only thing that really protects your data, because the operating system makes temporary copies of data in different folders, and if you only encrypt one folder, it's not really true that your data will stay in that folder. Someone says, how to use IDS to detect traffic between VLANs? Yes, you define the home network. Well, this is a question of where you put your sensors. And in a complicated modern network, you would have to put taps various places, and you'd have to combine them. And in fact, if you consider the modern network, not only are there's a network address translation, but there's multipath TCP in modern networks. So the same traffic stream might be split among multiple internet connections. So it can get very complicated with modern IDSs. You would have to have a group of sensors and a complicated device to put it all together. And I'm not quite sure which devices can do that, but I think enterprise class IDSs can probably handle that complicated situation. Honeypots are systems you put up to attract attackers. People have pushed this now and then. I think most people have concluded that this is not worth the time. You'd be better off doing normal defensive measures like changing default passwords and stuff, but it is an option to do this. And there's also honey nets, where you have a whole simulated network of honeypots. The main use of this, I think, is for people that want to collect malware to try to attract attacks. All right, and then asset management is a big deal. You need to know what you have. One simple thing is you need to know what you have so you can make sure you have enough licenses for all your software. Anyway, configuration management means you have a consistent configuration, so you have settings for your devices and you record them and save them, make sure every device is up to standard. That's called hardening, where you don't take a brand new device and connect it to the network. First, you go through a hardening step to change its configuration to a more secure one. And you can do baselining, which captures the security configuration at a point in time and records it. And of course, patch management is a huge problem. The fundamental problem is that the patches are low quality. Windows patches have been terrible for years. Windows 10 patches, every third one seemed to cause major problems. So you can't just put out a patch as soon as Microsoft or the other company issues it. So what you have to do is you have to have something like a virtual network with representatives of your machines, and you have to put the patch there, and then you have to run representative traffic and make sure it works before you deploy it. And that's a lot of bother. So at least a few years ago, they said most companies were at least 9 months behind on their patches because the patching was so burdensome. But if you don't patch, then you're vulnerable. So this is just a huge problem, and I haven't heard anybody have a really good solution. You use a patch management system to control it. You don't just want to have like automatic updates straight from Microsoft or something. You have your own patch management system, so patches only go out when they've been approved by your IT department after testing, and then you force everybody to get the patch, so they all get patched at once. But it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of breaches that happen because people do not put on the patches in time, because you can't just get in the habit of putting on patches, you'll break things. So it's a real problem. And then there's vulnerability scanning, where you scan with a vulnerability scanner, and this will find known problems, bad configurations, old versions, missing patches. And if you do, then you have to remediate them. Of course, this doesn't make you completely safe because there are zero-day attacks, which means even if you have all the latest patches, there's still nothing that will stop you. And the only thing that will protect you there is generic mitigations like network segmentation, two-factor authentication. And for the iPhone has a new super secure mode that came out a few months ago in the latest version for journalists and people who are targets of political attacks. You can turn your iPhone to extra secure mode, and there was a test last week or the week before. A new bunch of 0 days came out. There were 3 0 days, and one of them was actually blocked by that super secure mode. not all of them. So, setting your machine to just very secure settings can block some 0 days, but of course it can't block them all. All right. And then there's change management, of course. You can't let people change things about the network without recording it, considering the consequences, and going through an approval first. So you have a change control board and a change control management system to handle that. And so you identify a change you want to make, you propose it, then you assess the risk, you test it. If you decide to approve it, then you schedule the change, you notify everybody on this date we are going to change something, it will affect you in this way. You tell your help desk so people can call in if they have problems. Then you implement the change and monitor the results, and you have to have a rollback plan. If the change causes a huge problem, then you have some way to roll back to the previous one, which often happens when you do things like go to a new server version or even minor things. So let's try a Kahoot. This will be B, which is here. All right. Is it tomatoes or apples? Apples, sorry. All right. All right, so what defense protects personally identifiable information from leaving? All right, that's data loss prevention. All right. All right. All right, what defense correlates data from many sources? It's your security information and event management system like Splunk. It has many sources and puts it in a central database you can search. All right, what system will block all unrecognized software? Now they call that whitelisting. That's the old term. The modern term is allow listing. I'm not sure which one will be on the CISSP exam. Anyway, that's what it is. You list good things, and only things on the approved list can run. All right, what defense compares traffic to a baseline of normal activity? All right, that's anomaly detection. All right. Looks like you got frozen out of the Kahoots there, huh? I remember that happened to other students here and they had to use a different browser. Anyway. apparently some browsers work better than others for the cahoots. All right, so continuity of operations is part of a disaster recovery plan to keep things running, keep your IT running, and there's a lot of issues. One thing is your service level agreement. You determine what you regard as sufficient service, and this applies to your vendors, and it also applies to internal parts of the company if you organize it that way. I know Microsoft does organize their company this way. They have departments that provide service to Microsoft, and they have an internal service level agreement where they promise things like uptime. Fault tolerance. A fault-tolerant system is one that can survive a fault without having a failure. If something breaks, that's a fault, but if users no longer receive service, that's a failure. So if you have a fault-tolerant system, then you have something like you have multiple servers, multiple network connections, and so on. So if one fails, the other will continue to work, and your customers continue to get service. All fault tolerance relies on redundance. There is some alternative that can take over to compensate for the faulted part. Then there's backups that are, of course, extremely important so that if you have a disaster, you can recover. So your full backup is just all the data on a server. An incremental backup is done if you want to make the backup process faster. Then you try to avoid making extra unnecessary copies of old data. So instead of backing up everything every night, you back up only the data that has changed since previous backups. An incremental backup will compare to the last backup of any kind, and therefore if you have a full backup on Friday and an incremental backup on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, to recover Wednesday, you'd have to play all 4 of those tapes. A differential backup would always refer back to the last full backup. So if you had a full backup on Friday and differential backups on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, to reconstruct Wednesday, you would only need to play Friday's tape and Wednesday's tape. So those are different systems that are out there. RAIDs are not a backup solution, they are an availability solution. This is not a backup because if you have a RAID, an array of disks, and your building burns down, your data is gone. You need an offsite backup. That's a different purpose. The purpose of RAIDs is to provide availability in case one drive fails. So the most common is RAID 5 and the higher ones, where you just have a group of disks all running with an extra copy of stripes of data on it, so that if one of the drives fails, or sometimes more, it can recover. It has extra copies of data on them. The simplest one is a mirrored set, where it has a second whole copy of the data. So you have to have 2 drives to store 1 drive's worth of data. And so mirroring is the simplest one, 2 complete copies of the disk. RAID 0 does this skipping, where you put a little bit of data on each platter, and the platters are all spinning, but there is no second copy anywhere, so it is not fault tolerant. What it is faster to read and write, because your multiple read-write heads can be going at once. Parity is what it uses. It takes the XORed data from stripes on several drives and saves that. So it doesn't, if you're not doing mirroring, where it just stores a simple second copy of the data, you use this XOR process so you can make it cheaper. So for like a RAID 5, you can have 5 disks and you can store 4 disks worth of data. You only need 1 extra disk to store the extra parity, which is striped across the various volumes. So RAID 0 is striping without fault tolerance. RAID 1 is mirrored. RAID 3 is parity on a single drive. One drive just has all the extra redundant copy. RAID 5 has distributed the parity, which is better because if you put the parity on a single drive, then your RAID will run slower, because every time you're writing, it has to always write every byte up to the parity drive. This way the parity is striped around like a stripe here, and so all your read-write heads are screaming at once, and therefore it can move faster. RAID 6 can have dual distributed parity, so it can survive even if 2 drives fail, and there are complicated higher levels like RAID 10 and RAID 20 that mix these various redundant things together, striped set of mirrors and so on. One thing I've heard from drive savers is that you think, this seems mathematically like a great idea. If you had 5 drives, there's a very small chance that 2 of them would fail. They say in practice, very often, many drives fail at once. So it is apparently the case that they're not really statistically independent. It might be that the reasons drive fail is because of, say, power fluctuations, and that would affect all the drives. But the simple mathematics that you might apply doing like coin flips to decide what the probability of drive failing is doesn't necessarily work in practice as well as you'd think here. And drive savers said they very often have people bring in these huge RAID arrays and they have to recover the lost data from them because many drives did fail all at once. So redundant hardware, you have extra power supplies, network cards, disk controllers, just redundant entire systems, servers and such. You can have high availability clusters where there's two ways. There's failover and active-active load balancing. A failover is where you have something like a server and you have another server that has the data, but that server is not used until this one fails. And so there's a heartbeat signal sent across, and when the heartbeat stops, the other server takes over. This is simpler to design, but it does mean that the extra server is just doing nothing most of the time. The load balancing cluster makes more sense typically. Both servers are running all the time, so when everything is working properly, the customers get faster service. When one of them fails, the customers continue to get service, but slower because one device is down. All right. So business continuity planning is how you plan for your company to continue to operate before, through, and during a disaster. So if something horrible happens like COVID or a fire or something, you have a plan. Half the smaller businesses in America, half the businesses have no disaster recovery plan. Their disaster recovery plan is if the building burns down, we'll just go out of business. This is like small mom and pop restaurants and stuff. And that's one way to be. But if you want to get into the higher level, like corporate businesses that can make lucrative deals with other corporations where you sign multi-year contracts, you have to promise to survive, and it's not acceptable to just go out of business casually, so you have to plan for these things. So you make a long-term strategy to figure out how your business will survive as a whole, and that's the umbrella plan to keep the business up, and it has many plans inside it. One of them is the disaster recovery plan. This will define a specific disaster like a fire or a flood or a pandemic, and you'll have a specific plan of how to deal with that particular disaster. So you've got a business continuity plan is this whole thing, and inside there you have a lot of little plans. Continuity of operations is how you're going to keep your IT systems working. Your cyber incident response plan is how you're going to deal with intrusions and virus outbreaks. Here's your continuity of support plan for IT. Here's your disaster recovery plan for things like fire. Here's business recovery plan, crisis communications plan, how you're going to tell everybody what they need to know, like your employees and your customers and the government agencies involved with you. And then the occupant emergency plan, which is how you're going to protect your people physically. If something bad happens, like a building catches on fire, how are you going to make sure you get all your people out, get them medical care? If you're trapped in the building for days by the roads being blocked by a flood, how would you make sure people have medicine and someplace to sleep and things like that? All right, so you plan all these things based on maximum tolerable downtime. How long can you do without some part of your company? If it was unavailable, how important would that be? And how soon do you have to fix it? So you can sort your disasters by cause, like natural or human or environmental. That's one way to do it. And so you can have here examples of events: earthquake, tornado, hurricane, terrorism. Errors and omissions, the most common one, just mistakes made by your own people. I remember about 15 years ago, Amazon Web Services went down for like 4 days. And there was rumors that they'd been hacked, but no, they just deployed a new load balancing solution to try to improve their uptime, and it was backwards and it made their uptime crash. So, I mean, those common things, you'll make mistakes with your own staff that will bring you down. But all these other things can happen too. So, all right. All right, so temperature and humidity is important because without proper controls, your electrical equipment will break down more often. So you have to have backup power and heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, so you keep the humidity near 50% and the temperature within the recommended range for your servers and hard drives and everything. And you have uninterrupted power supplies give you a brief period of time when the power fails, like 5 or 20 minutes of power, and that's not intended to keep you in business. That's intended to give you time to start your generator, and then you can run as long as you have fuel for your generator. Or you can use this time to just shut down everything in an orderly way and then accept being down because you don't feel like paying for a generator. All right, so big disasters like terrorism and war will, of course, mess everything up, and you have to have plans. Personnel may be unavailable, unable to come to work, and so on. So you have to plan for all these things, how you're going to survive them. The most common thing typically is another location, perhaps in another country. so you can continue to do business while something like this is bringing down a whole location. Communications is a big issue. Often the telephone network will go down, the internet will go down, so now how are you going to reach people to tell them important things like they need to evacuate the building because it's on fire and things like that. So here's your process. You respond to the disaster, you activate your team, then you communicate to the people that need information, you assess the damage, and then you rebuild your devices, buildings, and what has to be rebuilt. So respond is your initial assessment of damage. You have to decide, is this really disaster? Or is this a smaller issue that we can handle in some normal way? And determine, is your facility safe for use? Or do we have to evacuate it? Then you activate your team. You should have a team responsible to handle the disaster. You may have to call people and have your employees call other people in call trees. And you have to have a plan. What are you going to do if the phone lines are down? Some people use ham radio as a backup. There's various alternative ways of doing it. Then you assess to see how bad is the damage. And you consider the maximum tolerable downtime of the various parts that are down and determine what order to bring them back in. And the number one thing is to protect the safety of your personnel. And then you reconstitution. You recover your critical processes either at the primary or a secondary site. You then have a salvage team determining what can be salvaged of the original site, and you eventually recover back to your original situation. But you may spend some period of time using temporary systems like other locations or business partners handling part of your business while your main site is unavailable or down. All right, so let's try another one of these. All right, so which disk array is not fault tolerant? RAID 0 is not fault tolerant, it's just done to make performance faster. All right, what's the most common source of disruption? Errors by your staff, of course, it's not that often that something comes in from the outside to attack your company, but all day long your own staff are doing things and they can make mistakes. All right, what server cluster uses all the servers all the time? load balancing. You have a load balancer that sends some of the work to this server and then some to that server and some to that server to keep them all busy all the time. And if one of them goes down, the load balancer just stops sending work to that server and sends it to different ones so the customers continue to get service. All right, what plan will deal with a specific disruption like a fire? That's the disaster recovery plan, which is tied to one particular disaster, so you will have many different disaster recovery plans for different sorts of disasters. XC, I know who that is. And gaming. All right. So, developing your business continuity plan and your disaster recovery plan. So you define the project, then you decide the scope, which is how much of your company will be protected or covered. Then you do a business impact analysis to determine how much it would affect your business if different parts were not working. Then have controls, a strategy, you develop and design your plan. Then you implement, train people, and test your plan, and then you have to maintain your plan because as things change, you have to keep updating your plan. So you see there's initiation milestones, you make a planning policy, business impact analysis to find your critical systems, preventive controls. Your IT contingency plan is what you're going to do if your main servers are down. You're going to have some other location somewhere with some other servers you can use. And then exercises, just like fire drills, where you test, train, and practice implementing this plan so you're ready when it happens, and then updating the list of personnel involved and whatever else you need to make sure that it's ready to go. So there's a sort of diagram here where you develop the policy statement, conduct the business impact analysis, identify the controls, and so on. A chart that just goes into more detail of those steps. You have to have C-level management, the CEO, CSO, that sort of thing. Some top executive must support this because this is expensive. You have to make people work, you have to use their time, you have to use resources. So if you are some lower level security person and you think you should have a disaster recovery plan when you don't, but your first job is you must convince upper management to support it. If you can't, then forget it. You can't do it from the bottom. You have to get allocation of resources from above, which is a big thing on the CISSP. They're always reminding you of this. Don't try to go rogue and do something to improve security at your company. You have to first get approval from top management and authorization to expend resources on it, or you will just make trouble and exhaust yourself and not accomplish anything. So, by the way, a proper plan may be good for the company even if you don't have a disaster, because the preparation process may help you organize your company better and be more efficient. So you have a manager. This is the manager to watch over the plan, and this person does not have to be in-depth technical skills. They're a manager. Their main skill is negotiation and people skills and authority in the company. They have to be the people that can get resources from management. And so you establish a continuity planning team that this is going to have stakeholders from everybody in the company. It is a very common mistake that some kind of do-gooders make a plan trying to support you, but they do not actually check with all the stakeholders. So in fact, their plan is not good and messes up people's work. So you have to have representatives there from all the parts of your company, not just IT, but human resources, physical security, managers, to make sure that they all understand what you're doing and that you're doing it in a way that will in fact work with them and not impair their ability to do the business. It is very common that you have some guy, high security guy in IT, passing some rules like we must have two-factor authentication everywhere, which cannot really be implemented by parts of the company, and then people are working around breaking the rules and stuff. All right, scoping determines what part of the company is protected, what part is covered by this plan. If you don't define the scope, then you have this phenomenon of scope creep, where you start doing something, but then you keep adding more and more to the project, so it never gets done. Then you determine your critical state, which is all your IT assets, who uses them, and how important are they, what would happen if they were down, to determine which ones are more important to bring up quickly. And business impact analysis determines the maximum tolerable downtime for each IT asset. For example, if you're a web company selling stuff, then your web server is the number one priority. If that's down, your company is not operating anymore. But your billing process, where you bill customers that have like 30 or 60 days to pay, it probably doesn't matter if that's down for a few days. So that's the sort of thing. You determine how long can something stay down. Then you do a risk analysis. And so you'll have something like this, like the server room is unlocked, that's a risk, that's the vulnerability. Some people might go in there, and there's the business impact analysis. People might steal the data off that system, for example, and so the mitigation is to install locks or something. If your software is out of date, that means you have insecurities from attacks. You might lose your data from a cyber attack, so updating it is the mitigation. And if you have no firewall, then of course you have a larger attack surface for attacks. And so moving, for example, to managed hosting would be a way to transfer risk, where you do not build your own firewalls. Instead, you outsource it to like Microsoft Office 365, and then it's somebody else's problem to deal with it. So these are various possible mitigations you might decide, and examples of what you'd go through. So when you're determining the maximum tolerable downtime, you determine the recovery point objective, how much loss can you withstand. So if you back up every night, then you might lose a whole day's worth of data. If your server has a catastrophic crash at like 5 p.m. before you back up, then you're going to have to do that whole day's worth of data over again. So that's your recovery point objective. Then recovery time objective is how long it takes to recover systems. How long does it take to find your backups and run them and get back to operation? Work recovery time is the time required to configure recovered systems. That's the sum of these two. The time before you're going to be back to full operation again is the time it takes to recover plus the time it takes to redo the work you lost. Mean time between failures is an estimate provided with hard drives and every other product, which is a rough estimate of how often you're going to expect to have to replace that component, and therefore you ought to plan for it failing at that time, so you'll know how many failures you can expect per year. And then there's mean time to repair and other requirements, environmental and connectivity requirements to make your system work. And supply chain is a huge one. After the SolarWinds attack and other supply chain attacks, this is a big problem now. Your suppliers might give you defective products or hacked products, and people are very concerned about this right now, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. We're just in the infancy of developing this. We're just beginning to develop a list of all the components in your product. That's called a software bill of materials, and tools are just being developed to create these and use these to try to assess how big of a risk it is that you're using software that came from other libraries outside your company. Everybody's doing it, and it's not very safe, and people are just waking up to this, and we're on the early stages of really dealing with it. However, in the old thing, you just have a service level agreement. So like if you buy routers from Cisco, they come with a high level of service. They're more expensive, but they'll just fly in somebody to replace them if they break. So that's nice. And then there's telecommunication. If your communication fails, you might be able to use your T1 lines, your Reddit lines, or satellite phones, or wireless networks or something to communicate with people. And you've got to consider all your utilities can go down. The power, gas, heating, cooling, water, all these things can fail, and you need to figure out what you're going to do if they fail. How would it affect your company, and are you going to have some alternative available? So there's various strategies. If you have no business continuity plan or disaster recovery plan, this is for small businesses that are amateurs that will just go out of business if they have a disaster. And as I say, that is only for small businesses that accept being small players in the world. You can't play on the big stage and be a major company with this low level of planning. So the next step up is a cold site where you have an alternate location, but with some equipment like the old version of your servers, but it's not even ready to go. It'll take you a long time to set it up. A warm site and a hot site have sites that are pretty much ready to go. And the most extreme one is a redundant site. This is what Amazon has and Cloudflare. They have multiple server farms all over the world, and each one of them has everything. So you can, if a whole location goes down, the other location will immediately pick up and deliver service with no interruption at all. This is the most expensive, of course, but this is what you do if you want continuous availability. So you couldn't take down Amazon with a nuclear bomb. You could blow up whole cities, and the other locations of Amazon would stay up. So that's a redundant site. So everything ready to go. The hot site, the equipment is ready, but it might take an hour or so. The warm site would take a few days to bring up, and the cold site might take weeks to bring up. So you determine your business. If you, for example, City College, at least before the pandemic, we didn't have very many online classes. Most classes were face-to-face, so the website was not really important. It could go down for like a few days, and it really didn't stop very many classes. Now these days, I'd say it's more important to keep our servers up. Anyway, you can have a reciprocal agreement where another company lets you use their data center for a while. You can have a mobile site on wheels. This is what telco communities have, like AT&T. They can drive into where a hurricane was and have just a series of trucks with power and food and cables and antennas and everything, so they can set up like a cell phone station in the middle of a vacant lot. You can outsource these things to subscription services. So you got a business continuity plan to sustain essential business operations while recovering, then a business resumption plan to bring it back, continuity of operations to keep your IT functions going during the disaster for, say, up to 30 days, continuity support, crisis communications, and instant response, which we talk about a lot here, got a whole class in it, how to deal with an attack, and disaster recovery plan for all kinds of specific disasters, and your occupant emergency plan to protect the physical safety of your human workers. All right, so there's these various related plans as we've talked about them, I think. A supply chain example. Even OpenBSD had experience when its FTP mirrors got compromised. Yes, that happened to Ubuntu also. Ubuntu had amateur clubs making mirrors you could download stuff from, and some of them were open FTP servers with default passwords, so people put up poisoned updates to Ubuntu. Yeah, it's happened, but the big thing that scared everybody, it happened to a really big company like SolarWinds that was trusted by a lot of companies, so it was much more serious than these sort of amateur open source things where you can kind of expect it. Anyway, we talked about these the crisis management plan, call trees and such. And of course, executive succession planning. What do you do if one of your executives is unavailable or sick or something? There should be someone else who fills in for them so you know who's in charge. The military is, of course, the king of this. If one soldier gets shot, they know exactly who the replacement is and who's in charge because they're prepared for that more than most companies. All right, so D is here. All right. There's a very good Wired article out going through how SolarWinds was discovered. And, it really took them 9 months to figure it out because they couldn't believe that the official software with the official update was hacked by Russia. That was a rude awakening. Ordinarily, you check and the official stuff signed by a reputable vendor, you don't have to worry about that. But it's not that simple anymore. All right, so what value measures the maximum time needed to recover systems? That's the recovery time objective. All right, which is how long it will take to actually perform the recovery process. All right, which option takes an hour to implement? That's a hot site. All right. All right, what process would use another company's data center? All right, that's a reciprocal agreement. All right. And which plan protects human life? That's the occupant emergency plan. All right. All right. All right. Well, I think we can just keep going. We got one more section. All right. So, backups and availability. Continuous availability is when you have no tolerable downtime, you need it to stay up all the time, and therefore you just need a redundant everything, another location with all the switches and servers and everything so it stays up. Another thing you might consider is hard copy data. If you actually have printed out stuff, then you might be able to recover that even if all your magnetic devices are destroyed. And then there's backups. You back up everything. We talked about this before. You can have incremental or differential backup. And you can have methods of rotating the tape. One common thing is you have 14 days of backups, grandfather, father, son, so you have daily tapes for a week. Then you keep one tape from every week, like the Friday one that's a full backup. Then you keep monthly tapes forever. So even a time years in the past, you can reconstruct it approximately from these backups. These are various systems. And of course, these days, a lot of people don't use tapes, they use electronic vaulting, so they back things up over the internet with things like Iron Mountain. So this is an option. You can even constantly back up all day long. That's called remote journaling, where you just save checkpoints in the database frequently, or database shadowing. You just maintain identical copies so you can recover more rapidly. Of course, you should be encrypting this stuff in transit, but I think everything's pretty much encrypted in transit these days. High availability options. Your active cluster has all the systems working. That's load balancing. Active passive requires the backup devices to come up when the main device goes down. And one thing that happened at the college, we had 2 firewalls in this configuration, and one of them would go down, but it wouldn't go all the way down. So it stopped transmitting the traffic, but it continued to send the heartbeat. So the other one didn't take over. So that was a failure of the active passive system. And then software escrow is an issue. Sometimes a company will put their source code at a trusted third party. For example, Microsoft has conditions under which you can audit the source code of Microsoft products without making it public. Some government agencies require the ability to audit the source code, so they get access to it under a non-disclosure agreement, but they can't publish it openly. This is the sort of thing that you might have, limited access to confidential company information. So you have to test your plan. You have to have a review where they read through the plan. Well, they read the plan, then a read through where they list all the components, and a tabletop exercise where everybody says, I'll do this, I'll do that, and you make sure that you've thought of everything and you discover errors in the plan. Then you can have a simulation test where you actually carry out the recovery process, and then parallel processing where you have backup systems where you duplicate the business transactions. And then you can have partial or complete business interruption where you actually turn off something important during a real business day to make sure the backup will come on. This is what Netflix has. They have a thing called the Chaos Monkey that turns things off randomly all the time. So everybody that develops any IT services at Netflix has to prepare for this. Everybody that writes software, databases, everything, they added this thing that will automatically turn things off at random, so you have to make sure there's always a backup for everything you do, which is a high level of maturity for availability. Then you train your people, make sure they know how to start the emergency power, call people, and make sure they're aware of what they should do. Even if they're not part of the disaster recovery planning team, they should know what they're supposed to do in the case of a disaster, like how to evacuate and so on. All right, and then you got to maintain the plan. So you have change control boards so that if people are changing things, your continuity team will know that and be able to change their plan to compensate for that. If you open up another location, then you're going to have to include that in your disaster recovery plan. So here's common mistakes. Management doesn't support it. Critical staff doesn't pay enough attention. The scope is wrong. You don't consider communications or supply chain. You don't test it or make people ready for it, or you don't keep it up to date. These are common mistakes people make. All right, so there are frameworks. There are official compliance frameworks for this. NIST has one for government systems. There's an ISO one in the 27000 series, a British one, and another one for Europe. Various compliance standards for your disaster recovery and business continuity plans. And there's a thing called the Business Continuity Institute, which has these practices, policy and program management, embedding business continuity, and technical practices, another compliance framework sort of thing that can guide you through making your company have a sufficiently good business continuity plan. All right, let's try the last Kahoot. Oh, okay. Never knew you could lock the game. I keep adding more features to Kahoot, but I'm not using them. All right. All right. So which system has MTD of 0? Continuous availability, this is like Google. No downtime is acceptable at all. They have redundant sites that take over instantly. All right. All right. Which one has 2 identical copies of a database? That's shadowing. All right. All right, so which is the most dangerous DRP test? I see. It shows you that when it's waiting. Okay. Anyway, so this is a complete business interruption where you turn off something while people are trying to use it. All right. All right, and which one is not a common error in business continuity planning? Yep, that's not common that you have too much testing. The rest of these things are all common errors. All right. So there's Damien. recording.